When you open up your Kumu map, there's really two ways to start visualizing your data. Both of them are accessed by clicking on Settings here on the right-hand side. And what always opens up by default is the basic editor. And the basic editor is very accessible. You have this nice menu where you can click on different buttons. And as soon as you do, your map visualization updates. So it's easy to work with. However, we also have another editor called the Advanced Editor. And you can access it by clicking Switch to Advanced Editor at the bottom. Within the Advanced Editor is CSS-inspired coding language, which make up all of the rules in your Kumu map. So whatever rule you create in your basic editor is automatically translated in your Advanced Editor. Now, there's really two options to work with this. The first one is to stick to the basic editor. You really don't have to be in the Advanced Editor if you don't want to. If you feel like it's overwhelming or you're not familiar with that code or you don't have the time to learn how to write that code, then it's easier to just stick to the basic editor and you'll be able to do about 85% of all of the things that you want to do within Kumu. However, if you do want to switch to the Advanced Editor, it allows you to do a couple of things. The first one is that it allows you to make quick edits. So as you can see here, the element size of this map, sizes of all the elements in this map are currently set to 150. And if I just want to quickly change that to 250 and make it a lot larger, I can do that in the Advanced Editor. So it allows for quick edits if you know where to be in the Advanced Editor. It also allows for more options. So for example, sometimes when you create a rule, there's only one way to create it. So for example, if I say connect the field by location, that automatically creates connections on my Kumu map, but I'm not able to now also connect by another field. So for example, if I go to the Advanced Editor again, I can now here next to location also say element type. And that allows me to cluster by two different fields. So that's just one example. And I'm going to go through all of the specific features that we offer in the Advanced Editor, which we don't have in the basic editor. But there's definitely some features that I find very powerful that can only be done in the Advanced Editor. It's also easy to copy styles over from one map to the other. So let's say that I want to, that I like the layout that I have here, or I want to use this in another map, then what I can easily do is just copy over this code, go to a different map and simply paste it again, and that will make it look the exact same way. So that's very easy when, like I said, if you want to copy over styles, but also if you just want to copy over a whole map with new data, then it's easy to just copy the Advanced Editor. And then lastly, looking at the Advanced Editor is great for inspiration, because sometimes when you're looking at a map, you don't really know how it was built. And once you start to understand how the Advanced Editor is set up and what the structure is, that you can start recognizing in other maps what that looks like and perhaps use it in your own map as well. Usually because the Advanced Editor references specific fields that only exist in your map, it is necessary that if you're copying over the Advanced Editor code from one map to another, it might be necessary to update the field name. Because, for example, in this specific map, there is a field called location, which indicates where a certain vegetable, where it was from. But maybe in your map, that field has another name. So in that case, you would have to update that in the Advanced Editor. Yeah, in the beginning, that may sound a little bit confusing, but once you start to get the hang of it, you'll know where to look for these fields and also how to update them. So fields are always within quotation marks, like you see here, location. So you can really, delete here and type in something else, and that will immediately update the map. Then another thing to remember, which you also just saw me do, is that whenever you're working in the Advanced Editor, and the basic editor too, by the way, but you need to make sure that you save your changes. When I change this back to location, there's three different options. The first one is apply, which basically shows me what I'm about to do, but it doesn't save it yet. So this is just to see if I like it. Another thing that you can do is to check this checkbox that says automatically apply changes. When I do that, it actually takes away apply and it just makes the updates as I make them. However, what's a little bit more difficult about or challenging about this is that sometimes when your map is really big and it's constantly making the changes as you're editing the Advanced Editor, then it might lag or it takes too long. So I usually just keep it off and wait for my changes, all the changes that I want to make, and then click apply. Of course, if I click save, this will now be the standard. So next time that I open my Kumu map, this is what the code will be. This is also important because sometimes you'll be working on a map for a long time, even just in the basic editor, and you forget to hit save. And that's just, yeah, such a pity because it doesn't save your changes. And then the last thing is reverts, and reverts basically just undoes the last thing what you did. Always good to keep in mind this yellow bar here at the bottom. Okay, so those were a couple of cases where I would recommend using the Advanced Editor. We would now go into the building blocks of what the Advanced Editor looks like. I'll first explain to you what the names are, and then we'll actually dive into a real project that already has these blocks so that you can see in real time where they come from and what they do and where they apply. So first place in the documentation that is a great place to start is the user interfaces, and then go to the view editor specifically. And there's a small subchapter about the Advanced Editor, what it does, and how it's built. This is also the structure that I will be using, but good to, if after this webinar you have many questions, to go through back to this one. So within the Advanced Editor, there's multiple different sections, as you can see here. First at the top, we have something that has an @ sign, and then it says controls. And whenever you're working with an Advanced Editor that's very long, so in this case, there's a lot of data, what I like to do is I use these arrows to shorten certain sections so that you are only looking at what you want to look at that moment. So in this case, I'm not going into the controls, so I can close this just to show you that add controls is one section. It's called a controls block. The second one is add settings, and I can also close that one. And then here, anything that is below add controls or add settings are visualization rules that apply to the whole map. And here I can indicate what I want the rules to apply to in terms of something that's called a selector. So first, let's go into what the settings does, because the settings is really the most general information about your whole map. So anything that goes into add settings really applies to the entire map, and it's more of a global settings that your data visualization had. So in this case, I can see below settings that the element size is 100 for all of my element, which is really the size of the circle itself. The second line is the element font size, which is 110. Now, of course, I'm zoomed out quite a bit, but you can see that the labels there, they all have the same font size. The background color of this map is white. Font cutoff, that's something that basically means how, if I zoom in or out, do the labels, so the font, do they disappear? In this case, it's set to 1. Which means it's not going to disappear because I always want the labels to be visible. I can go very deep into all of these possible properties, but we have so many, so I won't do that. But just to give you an example, that add settings is really the general rules for the entire map. And if I switch to the basic editor, as I mentioned earlier, anything that you do in the basic editor gets translated into the Advanced Editor. So the settings can be viewed in your customized default, so your default settings for the map. And here, if I, for example, change the preset layout from hairball, which is pretty wide, back to dense, which, it brings all the elements closer together. As soon as I go into the Advanced Editor, I'll immediately see that, close the controls again, I'll immediately see that reflected. Oh, I haven't saved it yet. Okay, here, the layout presets. I'll immediately see that reflected here. Now it's set to dense. Of course, I can also be in the Advanced Editor and change it back to hairball. You can really type in everything directly into the Advanced Editor. And as soon as you make a mistake or something Kumu doesn't recognize, it'll immediately tell you. So if I save this again, then it'll bring it back to what it previously was. Just to give you an overview that all of the settings here are translated into the add settings block. And what's also useful is that sometimes you're simply not able to go any larger. So for example, here the element size, it's already set to the max. So if I then go into the Advanced Editor, it gives me some more control because here I can set the element size to as large as I want. I can make it 1,000, which obviously will make all of them really big. really large. So it also gives me a bit more space to play around with certain values that I might not be able to find in the basic editor. So that's the first one, add settings. In add settings, it also holds any information about the template that you're using, really anything, like I said, that applies to the whole map. And I like to use this add settings reference, which if you're in the docs and you click on Advanced Editor Hub, you can click on add settings reference, and then you'll see this and all of the settings that are possible. This is what's called the property. And basically the property is this part here, what indicates which part of the map you're letting it apply to. Anything that is in front of this character is called a property. So if you're looking at the add settings reference, you can see all of the things that are possible with the description and the possible values. And especially when I started using the advanced editor, I basically just always had this doc and some other documentation open as well, just to always be able to go back and cross-reference. And that's how you kind of learn it along the way. So there's really no quick and easy way to learn how the advanced editor works or how to write this code. Especially in the beginning, you'll be referencing a lot of documentation. Similarly, it's not like I'm going to read through this one time and then I'll magically know how to write all of this code. I really will likely have to go back and forth many times. So it depends on if you have that time to spend or if you find that interesting to work on this, learning the advanced editor. But again, if that's too much, then you can also always stick to the basic editor. So I won't be going through all of these because there's descriptions, but good to know that the settings reference is there if you need it. Then the second one is the controls reference. I've explained this in previous webinars, but for those that are not familiar, the controls are basically these little dynamic toggles that I have on the map that allow me to play around with it as I'm looking at it. And it really allows me to look at the information that is relevant to me, especially for maps that are quite complex and there's so much data. Without having to look into each specific element, I can just say, okay, I'm looking at a map about academia, or I'd like to see a map about academia, and then it'll just show me that information. There's multiple different ways that you can create a control. So like you see here, these are drop downs, but you can also just have buttons at the top of your map, and also a more stylized button that has this button size line around it. So usually if you're in the basic editor, you would quickly create a control by going to add custom control. And then you have this menu that you walk through with all these different options on how to create it. And then at the end, you would say save. However, you can also create controls directly into the advanced editor. I would have to say that there's very few times that I will create a full control straight from the advanced editor. So what I usually do is I first create it in the basic editor, which then gives me the code that Kumu creates automatically to have the control. And then as soon as it's there, I can start making changes based on maybe some more advanced things that I want to see that aren't available in the basic editor. So here is the add controls, which indicates that anything that goes after this opening curly bracket applies to the controls. And then here you can see that I want the control to be at the top. I want it to be a filter control. I want the target. So which entities does the control apply to? Want it to be elements as opposed to connections. You can also have controls that just apply to connections. Then by is the field that I want to filter by. And then there's some more specific things like what do I want it to look like, a label, placeholder, what is the name that you'll see on the map, and some other settings that all apply here. I can also make changes here directly, right? So if I, for example, would only want to have the target be a certain element type, then I would update this value right here to a specific selector that says, I want this control to work, but I only want it to work on an element type that is ABC, for example. So that's how you would do that. Yeah, this can sometimes be a little bit tricky, but this, again, is a lot of trial and error. And also, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to support@kumu.io, and we're very happy to help with that. First, I want to go into the selectors and the properties. So especially when I was beginning with the advanced editor, I didn't really know what a selector or a property was. I didn't come from a coding background, so those concepts didn't mean much to me. I think it's very important that before you start, that you first kind of understand what they mean. And of course, they're explained here in the selectors guide. So yeah, this is the selectors reference that first explains what it is, and then also all the different options that you can have here. To summarize, a selector is basically the part of the code that indicates to what specific elements or entities you want your code to apply to. So in this case, we see the word element, and then there's an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket here, which again means that anything between these brackets applies to this specific selector. This selector, in this case, element, is global, so it means that it applies to all elements. You can see that I want the font color of all the elements to be black. I want the text to be aligned at the bottom. I want the border color to be gray. All of that is reflected in the map, and it applies to all of the elements. So if this is the selector, then this is the property, which I also mentioned earlier. So the property is the part of the code that indicates what the style is that you want to change. So in this case, font color. And then the value you can update. So right now it's set to black, but of course I can also make it yellow. And then as soon as I click apply, then you'll see that now all of my labels are yellow, which is very hard to read. So we don't want that. It's good to know that you can always make those changes like that. So that's the most simple selector. Element just applies to all elements. Same goes for connection. You can have something that applies to all the connections. And let's see if I can dive a little bit deeper into a selector that's more specific. For example, here, any element that has the element type of creator, I want them to be stylized differently. So anything, again, in between these two, the opening bracket and the closing bracket, only applies to this specific selector. So any element type that is a creator. And in this case, the element type creator only exists when I show that on the map. So it doesn't show here, but if I go here, creator, if I click this to now all of the elements are clustered based on who created them. And if I zoom in a little bit more and then click on Drew Mackey, you can see it's a little light gray here, but you can see that Drew Mackey is the creator of all of these maps. So I'm using an icon here. Icons is one of those things that you can only do within the advanced editor. It just makes your map look cool because you're using specific icons. But in this case, I want the icon to be of a user. So you can see this is a user, kind of like the cutout of a person. I wanted the color to be gray. But again, if I would make this red and then click apply, that would immediately make all of these icons red. So that's how you can play around with that. The color of the element itself is transparent. So that's why you can only see the outline of the icon. You don't see the outline of the element itself. And then the border width is 0, because if the border width is set to 1, then you would still see a gray border around the element, and I didn't want that. I just wanted it to look like this, like a person, and the label below it. So that's how you do it for more specific. And really, you can make these selectors as specific as you want. So especially here above, you can already see how specific they can be, because here I'm saying I want any creator that is not Kumu or not Jeff or not Alex or all these names. I want their image visibility to be hidden. So those are much more specific. Before you start maybe thinking, okay, this is probably too much to take on, there's a lot of ways in which Kumu can help you write these codes. So I didn't come up with this. I didn't type this out manually and just kind of like I'm speaking this whole other language and typed it out. I had Kumu create this for me, and then I put it all together and created it here as a styling rule. So that's a good thing to remember with selectors and properties. And I'll show you now how to do that. Let's say that I'm looking at a map and I've already used this color by to set the color. So let's say I've created this and I do have a legend here, but I ended up wanting to have a different color for fruit specifically. There's multiple ways to do this, but when I'm looking at data-driven decoration, so specifically, I'm creating a rule that applies to all elements with a certain type data, then I don't want to have to do that manually. And also, if I switch to the advanced editor, I might not know how to start writing it, because when the map is already finished, it's usually a little bit easier to look at the advanced editor and see what was done. But if you're just staring at this advanced editor and the cursor is blinking, you may feel, okay, I don't really know where to even start writing this. So what I usually do is I go back to the basic editor and I click decorate element. So here, there's a little menu that allows me to create the visualization rule that I want. So let's say here, I want the element type. Element type is fruit. Just a real quick sidebar, there's multiple ways to interpret this. So you can say it is, or it isn't, it contains, it's less than, greater than, has any value, or is unknown. So you can kind of play around with dependencies and conditions. But in this case, if I want to say, okay, element type is fruit, and I want to change that color, and I want to make it blue, in this case, I don't want to add it to the advanced to the legend. If I click done here now, and I switch to the advanced editor, you can immediately see that the color blue is now in my map. If I click to the advanced editor, you can see that Kumu created this rule for me, where first there was nothing, it was just my empty, just a blinking cursor. Now you can see, okay, the element with element type is fruit. I want the color to be, and this is a hex code, which I'll get into in a moment. But yeah, so Kumu created this for me. And now I can, from here, maybe even start writing a little bit more. I can say, okay, I know now that the property for font color is like this, and I want to make that specifically red. So there's two different ways to write out colors. I can, for the most basic colors, you can just say red, blue, yellow, green, and Kumu will use the most common color. But if you want a different shade for your colors, then we recommend using hex code. Hex codes is also one of those things that we don't come up with that ourselves. You can actually Google it on how to create those hex codes, and then pick a color, and then you copy over this code so that Kumu knows exactly what color to give it. From now that I have this selector, I can just keep adding more information that I might not be able to find in the basic editor, because it only applies to one specific element. And the same goes for connections. So I can say decorate connection. The idea is the same. If I go to direct connections, I can also say decorate all connections, but I just want to show you what it looks like. Change this style, make it dash, click done. And now it's a little hard to see, but now all of the connections are dashed. And you can see here, okay, this is an easy one, all connections. The style, which is the property, and the value is now dashed. So it's a pretty standard one. Lastly, I also wanted to show you how Kumu explains when you use any of the other conditions. So let's say the element type isn't fruit. What's useful is that you can already see Kumu creating it here. So now the fact that there's an exclamation mark, that indicates in CSS code language that it should be element type is not. And the same goes for any of this. It can be contains, which is done with an asterisk, is less than, is more than. You can see all of this update in real time. And I usually also really like this because it helps me understand, because the more you do this, next time you'll be able to write this one out manually just because you've seen it so many times. So there's really a lot of flexibility here in terms of coding, and definitely let Kumu help you write that code. You don't have to do it yourself for all of the selectors and the property. And of course, it's always good to reference our documentation, because we're aware that the advanced editor is a little bit challenging. So yeah, we give a lot of information in these documentations. And also sometimes we just give the exact code and you can just copy paste over. The ones that I always have open is add settings, selectors, and properties, because here you can see what all of these look like. This one, selectors guide, and it shows exactly all of the different things that you can do and where you can use selectors. So here, if you just write in a person, it'll select all elements with the person element type. If you add a hashtag before some text, then it'll select all of the elements that have that label. So if I go here, let me find an example, tomato. If I do this, say hashtag tomato, and then open up the bracket, and then I'll say color red. This closing bracket comes automatically when I open one. Click apply now, and now tomato will be red. So that's also really easy to use when it's these standardized fields like label or element type. You can write them fairly easily without having to really write out the entire thing. So longhand selectors, which is what we've been using already. So field name, operator, field value is the same as element type is fruit. So it applies to all that. And then there's a couple of other selectors here that are a bit more advanced. I won't be going into them right now because this is really intro into Advanced Editor and I don't want to immediately dump all of the hardest things on you. But there's definitely a way to select all connections that are coming from a certain element, or to indicate the direction of the connection, or the orphaned elements to elements without connections. There's a couple of ways to quickly indicate to Kumu what you want the styles to apply to without having to like really write it out or make it a lot more difficult. And one that I really like to use is traversals. Traversals is really about the information that is in the elements, but you reference the connection between the elements. So that's really nice if you're looking at this whole network structure and you want the color based on where a certain connection is coming from. And then lastly, this is how to write chain selectors. So chain selectors is kind of like a condition. So you can say, I want to select all elements with these three element types. And because there's a comma between these three selectors, I'm basically saying I want this styling or this code to apply to any element that has either the element type organization or the element type person or the element type project. So that gives you even more flexibility and really goes even more deeper into all the different options that you can use in the Advanced Editor. So yeah, that's basically just in summary, the Advanced Editor just gives you so much more flexibility, allows for so much more customization so that you can visualize the data in so many different ways. So definitely always take a look at that. The property reference is the same thing. It explains all of the different options that you can use once you have your selector. Remember that this is what's called a property. This one, the element size. So anything that applies to this specific selector, this is called the property. This is called the value. So the property reference explains what you can do for specific selectors. So for example, here you can see that elements is not checked off, and that's because elements cannot have arrows. Only connections can have arrows. If I go a little bit further, you can see color. Color can apply to elements, connections, loops, anything. And it just indicates which properties I can use for which selectors. So you can see font color can be used for most of them. And it just kind of explains to you like, hey, can I use this property for the specific selector? And of course, if Kumu doesn't understand, like I said before, it'll definitely let you know. There's kind of two ways that it lets you know. The first one is that it simply doesn't do anything. So you're making a change, but you're not really seeing the change happen. So let's say that I want to make this red, but I typed red instead of red. If I now click apply, then nothing happens. Well, actually, something does happen because the label just completely stopped taking any color at all. There's no font color at all. So that's why they're currently colored just like the elements. So then I would have to go back into here and I would see, okay, this is the error that I made. So I need to take this out. And if I then apply it again, now it's looking correctly. And it's a little bit tricky here because Kumu doesn't tell me where I've made the error. So sometimes I really have to go through all of my code and see where something went wrong. What I usually do is I just take parts out and until I find the culprit, so to say. So I'll just delete this entirely and then see what that does with the map. And then at some point, I'll finally see the change that I was intending to make. And then I'll, make that update there. Again, you can also always just send us an email and write to us saying something's not right and I don't know what it is. And we're very happy to help with that. And the second option is that, and this is often with when it comes to blocks. So here you see there's an opening bracket and there's a closing bracket. And that's very straightforward because there should always be an opening and a closing. If I now if I enter two closing brackets, Kumu is not going to understand that. So if I say apply now, I'm going to get this error saying there's an unexpected closing error on line 144. And that's correct because here you can see on line 144, there's an extra bracket. Same goes for when I take this one away, when there's no closing bracket. If I click apply, Kumu will say there's an unclosed block here at the top on line 137. Basically, what they mean is the opening bracket is on line 137, but there's no closing bracket, so I'm going to bring it down. And then the last option is where Kumu doesn't understand your code at all, and it will basically just bring the map back to nothing, as in it will give you the error, and it will also take away all of the visualization rules, not permanently, but until you tell Kumu what to do next. There's a huge red button here, or a red line over the entire map that says unable to parse view. So it'll type it like this. And then I already know that, okay, there's something that Kumu doesn't understand. So maybe I'm using a property that doesn't exist, or maybe I'm using a block that doesn't exist, or a selector that Kumu doesn't know what it is. It's always pretty clear what the issue is, not where it is exactly in the advanced editor, but Kumu does indicate what is going wrong. Okay, then to go into a few advanced features that only exist in the advanced editor. So the first one is imported views. There's also a documentation on it. Here it is, the imported views. Basically, when you're in your map, and here in the top left corner, there are two drop downs. The first drop downs is for different maps. And between maps, it allows you to use different templates or use different locations for your element. And there's also the drop-down for views, and different views allow you to decorate the data in different ways. So you can kind of look at the data from different angles. When you have a lot of views, at some point, every time that you create a new view, you're going to have to rebuild it, right? So what's useful about import is that you can just have a base. Let's say that you want the elements in all of your different views that you have, you want them to be blue. So instead of constantly, whenever you're creating a new view, to again have to indicate, okay, I want the element color to be this hex code, which in this case is the blue that you see on the map, you can just put that in a base and say, okay, these are the things that I want to see in all of my different views. So in this case, all views will have a control at the bottom. You can see it here. And the control filters, it targets the element. It is filtering by the field called theme. It's looking like a drop-down. The placeholder is show hide by theme, which we can see here. And all of these settings, the template is a stakeholder. I wanted to ignore the field tag, and the font size is 60, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of this information I want to have in all of my views. So this is a view that's called base. And now if I go into the view where I just was, you can see here at the top it says add import, and then it mentions the name that I gave to that view that I want to use. So in this case it's base, but it can also be anything else, just the name of the view and that you named that specific view. So as soon as I take this out, it takes away all of these settings. In this view, I have not indicated what color I want it to be, the size of the elements. So because I'm now no longer importing that information from another view, Kumu won't show that. And so imported views, I have to say, I personally don't use it a lot, but people that really have a lot of views, I do often see them using it to import it, because it just saves you the same steps over and over again. So that is imported views. It's, explained here, import my view. It's pretty straightforward. The second thing that you can do, and that's really one of my favorite features, I use it a lot, is partial views. And partial views basically allow you to bring multiple views into one view and go through them by clicking on a control at the top or somewhere in your map. And it makes for a very dynamic map. So for example, the example that I just had, this one's called changes over time. If I click the controls here at the top, we can see that, okay, in 2019 Q1, we started with this element. And then as soon as I flip through these time frames, so these quarters, you can see that this network has grown. Similarly, you can do this with different colors, right? You can do it with different coloring. You can do it with bringing data in and out. You can change the layout where the elements are placed and kind of flip through it. For that, we're using partial views. And partial views, like I said, is done completely in the advanced editor, which some people find it a little bit overwhelming, but it's actually pretty easy because there's a workaround on how to make it. Let me first show you the advanced editor, what that looks like, and then how I got to it. So it always starts with add view. and then the name of the view that you want to show up here at the control. So in this case, it's 2019 Q1. So there's an opening bracket and a closing bracket here on 11. So anything that is between these two opening and closing brackets applies to this specific view. So you can see here again, there's an add settings, which as I mentioned before, is just the settings for the whole map. And here are specific instructions on what this specific view, what it shows. So that's view number 1. Let me close it. And then here we have view number 2, which is this one. If we click on it, you can see all the settings here. And so in that way, all these different views are explained here in the code. Them all come back here. However, this map, of course, also, apart from the views, which are specific to only those views, there's also still the settings that apply to this main view. So as I said, you can see it as little tiny partial views into one main view. So this is the setting for the main view. So if none of the controls are activated, this is what the map looks like based on these settings. But as soon as I click on any of these views, now these settings, these view rules have become dominant and they're overriding the views of this main view. Again, you really don't need to start typing this out yourself and writing it out yourself. What I usually do is I create the view first. Yeah, you create the view first, 2019 Q1. Okay, so remember this was the first view when you were just looking at the first Q1. I'm seeing now that I forgot to import because the element doesn't have a color. So I'm just going to type this out. Import base, apply. Okay. So basically what you do is you create your separate view. Then once it's done, you copy over all this code and then you go to your main view again and you simply copy paste it into the view code here. So there's really no need to write anything yourself. You just make the map look like what you want it to look like and then copy it over. So that's what partial views does. And then lastly, there's the advanced editor. You can also use it for a couple of random things. So for example, if you want to add a radar, so these concentric circles to your map, you really don't have to think about it a lot. You just copy over this code. This is actually a good example to show you. You see now that the add settings block now exists here twice, which is not necessary. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to copy this part of the code and I'm going to place it inside of the other settings block. So then I can take this out. And as soon as I click apply now, then it's quite small because I haven't given a scale yet, but you can see the underlay now. Something that you can add. And then same thing goes for a background image. If you ever want to use a background image for your map, you can simply copy and paste the code from the doc. You can basically copy and paste over this one. The only thing that you would have to update is the URL that you see here. You would have to update it to the URL of your own image, and that would add an image to the map. And then lastly, it's also possible to add a scatter plot. So a scatter plot is basically like a graph where you can plot your elements based on X and Y coordinates. And there's this whole documentation about how to do that. But that's also something that can only be done in the advanced editor. Yeah, so this is what it would look like. You can make really cool visualizations based on certain quadrants on the map. We've recently brought a lot of the features that only existed in the advanced editor into the basic editor. So you can now use Snap to, and you can add a lot of grids and guides. But there's still some layouts that you can only access through the advanced editor. And again, you can find those in the documentation. Oh, and one last thing that I wanted to show, which I also love to use, is popovers. Popover is basically that when you hover over an element, that it shows you a little example of what the profile looks like. So only the most important information. And you also create that in the advanced editor. So here now I'm hovering over this one, but also if I click on the element and I close this one, then I can see more information. Popovers are really useful if you want people to have some quick access without really having to click on each specific profile. And popovers, again, it's explained in the documentation. You can really copy over the code one-on-one on how to create it, but I can show you here what it looks like. Let me see where I can find it. Usually this is what I do. I just go through the advanced editor looking for certain properties, and then I know where it is. Okay, here. So you'll see popover, and it's only applying to the element type that is not a creator, and the element type that is not a map template, and the element type that is not a Kumu feature. I do that on purpose in this case because I just don't need popovers everywhere. But the popover itself is written here. So you can see that I'm using the image field and the label field and some other specific fields. But you can, for example, also have a popover that only shows the label and nothing else. Popovers are also really, really cool, and I use them a lot. So yeah, that's basically the intro to the Advanced Editor. I do hope that I haven't overwhelmed you too much and that you'll still really give it a try, because really, Advanced Editor, you love it or you hate it. But once you do get the hang of it, it opens up so many possibilities for your Kumu map. One caveat that I have to give is that Kumu v3 will not have an Advanced Editor, and especially our Kumu power users that have used the Advanced Editor extensively, they were a bit shocked by this news. But basically what we're really trying to do is bring everything that you can do in the Advanced Editor into a menu such as the basic editor that just looks nicer and is really much more accessible for everyone, because there's just a very large use base that doesn't want to work in the Advanced Editor. However, none of the functionalities in the Advanced Editor are going away completely. You'll still be able to copy over views easily. You'll still be able to make adjustments, but we just want to make all of that more accessible, and we didn't really have to require anyone to be able to write code to do really cool things with your Kumu map. So this video will be on YouTube for probably a year as we introduce Kumu v3, and as Kumu v3 and v2 will exist side by side for a while. And then at some point it will become obsolete because we're just going into Kumu v3. So that's something to remember if you feel like, okay, if it's going away anyway, I don't even want to learn the Advanced Editor, that is totally fine. It's exciting if you have time to work on it, then it's cool to learn how all of that works.